Article 73 in the United Nations Charter is one of two articles in what is referred to as Chapter 11 of the UN Charter. I'd like to go back to the actual creation of the Charter itself because it is relevant to what shows up in Article 73. The UN was created and the Charter adopted in 1945. At that time, there were only 50 or fewer states in San Francisco adopting the Charter, and the process at that time was largely controlled by Western powers, in particular UK, France, and the USA. So at San Francisco, they decided to deal with the question of colonization in two separate ways. One would fall under Chapter 11, which concerns what the Charter authors designated non-self-governing territories, and the other colonial or colonized peoples would fall under Chapter 12, which covers trust territories. Now, the real reason why they split the colonial peoples into two separate chapters was because they wanted to treat the colonial possessions of the winners of the war differently from how they treated the colonial territories of the defeated states in the war. So, in other words, colonial possessions of US, UK, France, Spain, Portugal were put in under Chapter 11, and there are two main points to Chapter 11, and in particular in Article 73, which is the first article of Chapter 11. The two main points are that the administering power of these colonial possessions were allowed to remain administering powers, but were placed under a sacred trust to respect the paramount interests of the peoples that they administered. This means that if there is a conflict of interest between the interests of the colonized peoples and the interests of the administering power was under a sacred mandate to elevate the interests of the peoples that they administered and not their own administering power interests. The second point in that Article 73 is that the administering power had to send in annually reports to the Secretary General explaining how they were fulfilling this particular mandate. And the mandate, in addition to speaking about the paramount interests of the colonized peoples and the sacred trusts that was put on the administering power, essentially said that the administering power had to do everything possible to move the colonized peoples towards self-government. Now, if you look at Chapter 12, which applied to the colonial possessions of Germany and Japan, there they said that the administering powers, which by then were no longer Japan and Germany because the UN removed their power over their earlier colonial possessions and invested in the UN, which in turn then delegated out to chosen states such as the US over Micronesia, for example. In Chapter 12, the mandate was that the administering power had to prepare the peoples there for independence. So you see the difference between the two chapters. First of all, Hawaii was placed under Chapter 11, i.e. under the chapter that governs the conduct of administering states over non-self-governing territories. And as such, the U.S. had the sacred trust duty to advance the interests of the inhabitants of Hawaii and move them towards self-government. Now, and also to send reports on an annual basis to the Secretary General to show how it was fulfilling its mandate. Now, as I mentioned, that mandate to move peoples in the non-self-governing territories towards self-government was put in the Charter in 1945, when most of the power at the UN at that time resided still in the colonial powers. But as the years progress and more territories decolonized in Asia and Africa, and states such as India and Burma and so on entered the General Assembly and found that they had much in common with the Soviet bloc countries, which also were for total decolonization. They developed a majority in the General Assembly that was not content with the notion of mere self-government under Chapter 11. So by 1960, that bloc managed to get adopted by the General Assembly by a vote of 89-0, with about 10 abstentions, of which the US was one, along with the UK, France, etc. But the declaration that the Third World Socialist Bloc managed to get adopted in the General Assembly in 1960 rectified that defect in Chapter 11 of the Charter, because it said, regardless of whether peoples were covered by Chapter 11 or by Chapter 12, that is, regardless of whether they were non-self-governing territories that belonged to the Western powers, or they were inhabitants of the trust territories administered by the UN or on behalf of the UN, that difference no longer mattered. They were all entitled to pursue independence. And that happened in 1960. As we know, the United States in 1959, that is 1 year and 1 year only before this declaration, held a plebiscite in Hawaii, where the question posed was, do you, inhabitants of Hawaii, wish to opt for statehood or to remain a territory of the United States? Now, I'd like to mention 2-3 major points in connection with that. First of all, the U.S., being an active member of the UN, could tell that from 1945 until 1960, there was this really strong surge for something more than just self-government. So they could predict that sooner or later there would be a demand to grant full independence. So surely they would have understood that they should have the people in Hawaii vote what they want before they automatically are entitled to independence. Hence, the vote, in my view, was rushed through in 1959. Secondly, the question posed, limited the choice to, would you like to be a territory of the U.S. where you don't even have a vote in how your lives are governed, or would you prefer to be a state where you in fact do have some vote over political matters? But absent from that choice was the choice of independence. So that's the first major flaw in that vote. I would say the second flaw. The first flaw was what I suggest, which is that the U.S. rushed this vote, knowing that any time now a declaration on the granting of independence was about to go through the UN. The third flaw is, the suffrage, meaning who were allowed to vote. So if the U.S. colonized Hawaii in 1898 when it annexed Hawaii, then there are all kinds of arguments as to who was entitled to undo that unlawful deed. The people who lived there in 1898, or maybe the people who lived there and were citizens of the Republic of Hawaii. But better yet, it probably should be the people who lived in Hawaii and were subjects, i.e. citizens of the Hawaiian Kingdom in 1893 when Queen Liliuokalani was overthrown. But certainly not anybody fresh off the ship in 1960.